The heavy autumn rain was relentless, blurring the neon lights of the unfamiliar city skyline into a smear of cold blues and grays. Lillian leaned her forehead against the fogged-up window of the cab, her breath leaving a faint mist on the glass. Every bump on the wet asphalt sent a shiver through her tired frame. She was entirely out of her depth, moving to this massive city for her university degree with nothing but 2 oversized suitcases and a fading hope that her relationship with Julian would finally feel real again. They had been drifting for months, their phone calls growing shorter, his voice becoming a detached echo. When the cab finally pulled up to the weathered, brick apartment complex, Lillian dragged her heavy bags through the dim, narrow corridors. The hollow, metallic roll of the wheels echoed against the concrete walls, sounding painfully lonely. When she reached apartment 4B, she took a deep, shaky breath and knocked. The door opened, but there was no rush of warmth, no tight embrace of a boyfriend who hadn't seen her in 3 months. Julian stood there in a gray sweatshirt, his eyes fixed firmly on the glowing screen of his tablet. He offered a faint, polite smile that didn't even reach his eyes. "Hey, Lillian. Glad you made it through the storm," he said, stepping aside carelessly. "Come on in. Just drop your bags by the hallway. Like I told you over text, my roommate Liam shares the place, but he's usually out late. Make yourself at home." Lillian stepped inside, her heart sinking into a familiar, hollow ache. She sat on the edge of the small fabric sofa in the living room, her hands tightly clasped in her lap to hide their trembling. Julian sat on the opposite armchair, his fingers flying across his screen, talking rapidly about his grueling schedule at his new corporate internship, his upcoming evaluations, and how he barely had time to sleep. He didn't ask about her exhausting 10-hour journey. He didn't look up to notice how pale her lips were from the cold, or how much she desperately needed him to just reach out and hold her hand. The emotional distance between them felt like an ocean, even though he was sitting less than 3 feet away. Suddenly, the heavy click of the front door lock pierced the quiet room. The door swung open, and a rush of cold, rain-scented wind swept into the hallway. A tall figure stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Oh, Liam, you're back," Julian muttered, not looking up from his tablet. "This is Lillian. She's staying on the couch for a couple of weeks until she finds her own place." Liam turned, shedding his damp black coat. As he stepped into the soft amber light of the living room, Lillian's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to command the small space, and dark hair slightly tousled and damp from the rain. But it was his eyes that froze her in place. They were an intense, piercing gray, and the moment they landed on her, the careless atmosphere of the room vanished. Unlike Julian's vacant glances, Liam's gaze was heavy, focused, and unblinking. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the slight shiver of her shoulders, the dampness of her hair, and the unmistakable shadow of exhaustion and heartbreak in her eyes. It felt as though he had read her entire state of mind in a single, silent second. "Welcome, Lillian," Liam said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, so rich and low that she felt the vibration of it strike somewhere deep in her chest. He walked closer, his movements slow and deliberate, stopping just a foot away from the sofa. "The city can be brutal during a storm. You look freezing." Before she could even process his words, Liam reached out. His hand was large, warm, and steady. He didn't just give a polite shake, his fingers brushed against the icy skin of her wrist as he subtly checked her temperature, his thumb lingering for a fraction of a second against her pulse point. The contrast of his intense body heat against her freezing skin sent a sudden, electric shock straight up her arm. Lillian's heart gave a violent thud against her ribs. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked up into his, trapped by the sheer intensity of his focus. For a lingering, breathless moment, neither of them moved. The air between them grew thick, heavy with an instant, unexplained magnetism that made the rest of the apartment fade into absolute static. She could hear the rapid, shallow sound of her own breathing, and she was certain he could hear it too. I'll get you a blanket," Liam murmured, his voice dropping an octave, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips before locking back onto her gaze. The warmth of his breath brushed her cheek, sending a wave of heat through her frozen veins. "Thanks, Liam, appreciate it," Julian called out carelessly from his chair, completely blind to the invisible current of electricity passing between his roommate and his girlfriend. Liam slowly pulled his hand back, his fingers dragging across her skin with an agonizing slowness that left a trail of fire in their wake. He turned to fetch the blanket, leaving Lillian sitting there, her heart racing at a dizzying speed, her skin burning where he had touched her, and a terrifying realization settling in: she had been in this city for less than an hour, and a complete stranger had just made her feel more alive than her boyfriend had in 2 years. The following days in the apartment felt like walking through a minefield of unspoken tension. Julian remained a ghost, leaving before dawn and returning past midnight, too drained by his internship to notice anything outside his own reflection. But Liam was always there. His presence filled the small apartment like a low, vibrating hum, a constant source of heat that Lillian found herself subconsciously gravitating toward. It happened in the smallest, most unavoidable ways. The apartment was cramped, its narrow kitchen barely wide enough for one person to move comfortably. On the 4th afternoon, Lillian stood by the counter, pouring water into a glass. She was lost in thought, staring out at the gray city drizzle, when she heard the soft thud of Liam's bare feet against the hardwood floor. "Let me help you with that," his voice rumbled from directly behind her. Lillian gasped softly, her shoulders tensing as she turned around. She hadn't realized how close he had approached. Liam was standing mere inches away, his towering frame completely blocking out the rest of the kitchen. He reached past her to grab a coffee mug from the upper cabinet. As he did, his chest brushed lightly against her shoulder. The contact was brief, but the sheer, radiating body heat emanating from him through his thin t-shirt was staggering. Lillian froze, her back pressed against the edge of the counter, completely trapped between the cold marble and Liam's suffocating proximity. She could smell him, an intoxicating mix of cedarwood, clean laundry, and the faint, bitter scent of black coffee. Liam didn't pull back immediately after grabbing the mug. Instead, he kept his arm raised, hovering over her, his eyes dropping down to meet hers. At this distance, Lillian could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. The silence in the kitchen became absolute, save for the sudden, rhythmic pounding of her heart against her ribs. It was so loud she was terrified he would hear it. Her breath hitched, trapped in her throat, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow movements. Liam's gaze intensified. His eyes drifted down to her mouth, lingering on her parted lips for a breathless second before snapping back to her eyes. He lowered his arm slowly, his forearm grazing the side of her neck. The skin-on-skin contact left a trail of goosebumps in its wake. "You're holding your breath, Lillian," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that vibrated against her skin. She tried to speak, but her throat was completely dry. Her hands, resting on the counter behind her, tightened their grip until her knuckles turned white. Liam leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer. His presence was overwhelming, a magnetic pull that felt entirely dangerous yet completely irresistible. "Are you scared of me?" he asked softly, his eyes locking onto hers with an honesty that stripped away all her defenses. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring of her own pulse. And it was the truth. She wasn't scared of him, she was terrified of the wild, unyielding reaction her body had whenever he was near, a reaction Julian had never, not even once, managed to evoke. Before the moment could break, the sharp, discordant buzz of Lillian's phone on the counter shattered the silence. The screen lit up with Julian's name. The sudden reminder of reality felt like a bucket of ice water. Liam blinked, the intense spell breaking just enough for him to take a step back, though his eyes remained fixed on hers, dark and clouded with a heavy, restless longing. He gave her a slow, tight nod, stepped out of the kitchen, and left her alone. Lillian collapsed against the counter, her knees trembling violently, her hand shaking as she picked up the phone, her mind completely consumed by the heat of a man who wasn't her boyfriend. By the end of the week, the atmospheric pressure inside the apartment had grown suffocatingly thick. Every shared glance across the dinner table became a silent conversation, and every accidental brush of their shoulders in the hallway felt like a spark dropping onto dry wood. Julian, entirely swallowed by his own world, announced on Friday evening that he had to leave for an out-of-town corporate retreat until Sunday night. He packed his bag carelessly, gave Lillian a brief, dry kiss on the cheek that felt more like an obligation than affection, and vanished through the door. The moment the lock clicked into place, the apartment fell into a heavy, profound silence. Lillian stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, feeling the sudden, vast emptiness of the space. Then, Liam stepped out of his room. He had changed into a soft, dark flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the strong, corded muscles of his forearms. He stopped at the edge of the room, his gray eyes locking onto her with a raw, undivided focus that Julian had never possessed. Without the buffer of her boyfriend's oblivious presence, the air between them instantly charged with an unbearable, magnetic tension. "The storm outside is getting worse," Liam said softly, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. "You shouldn't stay cooped up in your thoughts. Let me make you dinner." Lillian could only nod, her heart giving a nervous, erratic flutter against her ribs. An hour later, the apartment was bathed in the dim, amber glow of a single kitchen lamp. Outside, the rain beat a relentless, rhythmic tattoo against the glass, creating an intimate, isolated world just for the two of them. They sat side by side on the small sofa, the dinner plates long cleared, leaving only 2 warm mugs of tea between them. "You're quiet tonight, Lillian," Liam murmured, shifting his weight so he was facing her. The movement brought him closer, so close that the heat radiating from his body washed over her in intoxicating waves. "I'm just thinking," she whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on her mug, terrified that if she looked at him, she would lose her resolve. "About how temporary everything is. How I'm just a guest here, disrupting your life." "You aren't disrupting anything," Liam countered instantly. His tone was suddenly fierce, laced with an emotional intensity that made her look up. When her eyes met his, the sheer hunger and longing in his gaze made her breath hitch sharply. He set his mug down on the table with a soft clink and reached out. His large hand moved with an agonizing, deliberate slowness, hovering for a fraction of a second before his knuckles brushed against the soft skin of her jawline. Lillian nodded, her eyes opening to look into his piercing gray ones, seeing her future written in them with absolute certainty. The fear was gone, replaced by an unbreakable warmth. They stood there, bound together in the dim amber light, ready to step out of the shadows and face the storm together. Julian's footsteps suddenly echoed down the hallway, breaking the intense silence of the kitchen. Liam didn't step back this time. He kept one steady, protective hand firmly anchored on Lillian's waist, his piercing gray eyes locked onto the doorway, while Lillian took a deep, shaky breath, her fingers remaining intertwined with Liam's. Julian walked back into the room, his eyes fixed on his phone as usual. "So, about that apartment," he stopped mid-sentence, finally raising his eyes. He froze, his gaze dropping to Liam's hand wrapped possessively around Lillian, and then to the unmistakable, flushed warmth on both of their faces. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. For the first time in 2 years, Julian was looking at them with full, undivided attention. "What is this?" Julian asked, his voice hollow, a mixture of confusion and sudden shock crossing his features. Liam took a slow, deep breath, his broad chest rising and falling in a calm, resolute rhythm. He didn't flinch. "Julian, it's over," Liam said, his voice deep, gravelly, and entirely unwavering. "You haven't been here. Not for her, not for this relationship. I see her. I love her. And she's not moving into that apartment. She's staying here. With me." Julian blinked, looking at Lillian, waiting for her to contradict his roommate. But Lillian stood tall, her hand squeezing Liam's tightly, drawing immense strength from his radiating body heat. "He's right, Julian," Lillian said softly, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. "We've been living like strangers for months. You moved on a long time ago, and you just didn't want to admit it. I'm sorry, but my heart belongs here now." Julian stared at them for what felt like an eternity. The truth of her words seemed to hit him all at once. There was no explosive anger, no dramatic shouting. Instead, a quiet, deflated realization washed over him. He looked at their intertwined hands, seeing a depth of emotion and fierce chemistry that he had never even tried to build with her. With a slow, bitter nod, Julian picked up his briefcase from the counter. "Right," Julian muttered, his voice quiet. "If that's how it is. I think it's better if I stay at a hotel near the office for a few days to figure things out." He didn't look back as he walked out the front door, the heavy click of the lock signaling the definitive end of a cold, dead past. The moment the door closed, the heavy burden that had weighed on Lillian's chest for weeks instantly evaporated. Liam turned to her completely, his face filled with a raw, overwhelming emotion. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his powerful arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet and pulling her into a tight, breathless embrace. Lillian buried her face into the crook of his neck, inhaling the intoxicating scent of cedarwood, weeping tears of pure relief and happiness. He slid her down slowly until her feet touched the floor, but he didn't let go. His long fingers gently framed her face, tilting her chin up so her eyes met his piercing gray ones, now shining with an unyielding, happy warmth under the amber kitchen light. "You're safe now," Liam whispered, his ragged breath brushing against her lips, his heart hammering in a wild, joyful rhythm against her chest. "No more secrets. No more hiding in the dark." "I love you, Liam," she breathed, her hands sliding up to tangle fiercely into the dark strands of his hair. Liam leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. This kiss was entirely different from the ones before. It was still intensely deep, filled with the same suffocating passion and electric chemistry that had brought them together, but now it was laced with a profound, beautiful sense of peace and victory. His mouth moved over hers with a slow, dramatic sweetness, lingering on her lips as if committing the texture of her smile to memory. Outside, the heavy autumn rain continued to pour, washing away the old city smog. But inside, wrapped in the fierce, unyielding warmth of a true, passionate love, Lillian knew she was finally home.